Horror remakes have always been controversial. Some are little more than modern retellings, while others manage to take original ideas and do something fresh and new with it. And while many franchises fail to do this, one franchise that has managed to actually do it, in my opinion, is The Hills Have Eyes. Across 4 films and 30 years, we've seen this franchise span from a gritty exploitation classic to a modern, brutal survival horror series. So today, we're taking a look at every film in the franchise, the originals, the remakes, their sequels, to see how well they hold up, what they're really trying to say, and ultimately, which one stands above the rest. This is The Hills Have Eyes Retrospective. You know, it is really easy to dismiss The Hills Have Eyes as just another exploitation horror film from the 1970s. Because on the surface, it certainly has all the hallmarks of one. It has gritty violence, disturbing villains, and a very simple survival premise. But I think that really overlooks what Wes Craven was trying to explore with this film. Because at its core, The Hills Have Eyes to me is really trying to explore the illusion of civilization. The Carter family enters the desert believing they are protected by everything modern society has given them. They have money, education, a vehicle, firearms, and maybe a little too much confidence. They represent what many would consider the American ideal. A hardworking American family that is enjoying retirement and taking a cross-country vacation. And it is because of that exact comfortability that they think that the rules of civilization still apply. But the problem is, the desert does not care, because once their car breaks down, all of those luxury comforts in life begin to slowly disappear. Their possessions become useless, and their social status means absolutely nothing in the desert. Even the law, the institution that they're accustomed to relying on, is just nowhere to be found. Because the farther away that they move from civilization, the more those civilized behaviors just begin to erode. And that is where the hills themselves become interesting. Throughout the movie, the hills are always there, always looming in the background. They almost feel like silent observers, reminding us that nature has always existed and will exist long after civilization has ended. While the Carter family believes in maps, roads, and order can explain the world around them, the hills represent something far older and that is completely indifferent to the human rules. In many ways, the desert strips away everything and returns everything to its basic instincts: survive, protect your family, and destroy anything and anyone that would ever threaten that. But that is also true for both families, and I think that's what makes this so fascinating to study. At first glance, the Carter family and the Jupiter family appear to be complete opposites. One is very civilized, while the other is very savage. But the longer the film goes on, the more those lines begin to blur, and those differences begin to just completely disappear. Both families have extremely strong patriarchs that expect absolute loyalty. Both are fiercely protective of their children, and both are absolutely willing to do what is completely necessary to ensure their survival. By the end of the film, Doug isn't even simply escaping the cannibals, he's hunting them. The final freeze frame is one of the most important shots of the film because Craven refuses to tell us how we're supposed to feel. Instead, he chooses to let us sit with the uncomfortable imagery of revenge. Yes, Doug wins. But does he really win? Or has he become just another product of a violent world? I don't think Craven is trying to say that civilization is fake. I think he's trying to expose that civilization is rather fragile. It's something that we maintain only because society allows us to. You remove the police, you remove the laws, and you remove the comfortability of everyday life, and we are forced to ask a question that nobody really ever wants to ask. What kind of person would I become or you become if survival was the only thing that mattered? I think it's extremely important to remember when The Hills Have Eyes released. Released in 1977, America was still recovering from the Vietnam War and the Watergate scandal. Public trust in institutions had been completely shaken, and a lot of filmmakers were coming out making darker, more cynical films about American life. Horror movies as a whole were already shifting into a different direction, away from the gothic monsters and towards ordinary people doing extraordinary violence. And that's why The Hills Have Eyes fits perfect into that movement, because the monsters aren't supernatural, they're human. And that's why nearly 50 years later, The Hills Have Eyes remains more than just an exploitation film. It truly is a film about if the structures of our life that we depend on so dearly really do disappear, and whether that line between civilized people and the monsters we fear is ever as clear as we would like to believe. Following the success of the original, it was not long before a sequel was greenlit. Wes Craven returned to write and direct, and on paper, that sounds like a recipe for just another classic. But unfortunately, The Hills Have Eyes Part 2 is probably the weakest film of the entire franchise. Now, to be fair, there are plenty of reasons for this, and I'm not going to hold it against the film that much. The production ran into so many financial problems that it was never truly finished. Rather than reshooting or expanding the story at all, the film heavily relies on footage from the original film to pad the runtime. That's why so much of the movie feels like you're watching the first film all over again. The plot itself is much simpler this time around. Years after surviving the massacre, Bobby Carter and Rachel, formerly Ruby, are trying to move on with their lives. A group of motocross riders heading through the desert ends up crossing paths with Pluto, who somehow survived the first film and is accompanied by a new family member called Reaper. What follows is a pretty stereotypical slasher movie with all the people being killed off one by one. And that is really my biggest criticism with this film. It really felt like this film lost all of the heart of the original movie. The first Hills Have Eyes was not just about cannibals attacking people in the desert, it was more about people being put in unimaginable situations and forced to survive. Violence served the story. Every death pushed the Carter family closer to being just as savage as the people that were hunting them. And the sequel just abandons all of that. Instead of focusing on trauma, morality, and survival, it almost entirely focuses on body count and suspense sequences. These characters exist less as people and more as just cannon fodder to be killed off one by one. I wouldn't say it's necessarily a bad slasher, but it is a disappointing Hills Have Eyes film. I also think this film majorly reflects the horror shift of the 1980s. By 1985, audiences have already embraced franchises like Friday the 13th, where the killer became the main attraction. People were not coming back for memorable themes, they were coming back for body counts and memorable kills. They wanted recognizable monsters and another movie in their favorite franchise. And The Hills Have Eyes Part 2 felt like it was trying to fit into that mold that it never really belonged in the first place. Instead of asking more difficult questions like the original did, it became more interested in keeping Pluto around as a reoccurring killer. In a way, the franchise stops becoming about ordinary people confronting their capacity for violence and simply just turns it into surviving the next attack. Of course, it is impossible to talk about this film without mentioning the flashbacks because they are everywhere. Characters repeatedly remember events from the first film, and then, for reasons I don't think anyone can fully explain, the family dog Beast has a flashback of his own. It is one of those moments that becomes legendary among horror fans for how unintentionally funny it is. And what's so ironic is that the flashback is not really a problem in itself. I think having the flashbacks does nothing but highlight how much better the original film was. Finally, I don't think The Hills Have Eyes Part 2 is completely without value. Michael Berryman as Pluto is still entertaining as Pluto. There are some pretty good suspenseful sequences, and it is good to go back and revisit a film that Wes Craven himself revisited. But it also feels like a filmmaker working under impossible circumstances. The lack of budget, the unfinished production, and the heavy reliance on flashbacks to pad out the runtime just kind of make this a very forgettable sequel. Ironically, I think the biggest lesson that The Hills Have Eyes Part 2 taught us is how hard it is to follow up a story that had already been resolved in the first film. The first film was never about just defeating monsters. It was about slowly becoming those monsters that were hunting us. And unfortunately, once that story had been told, simply introducing new victims with new kills just was never going to carry the same weight. After the disappointment of The Hills Have Eyes Part 2 in 1985, the franchise went quiet for about 20 years. And in 2006, horror was in the middle of a remake boom. Films like The Texas Chainsaw Massacre from 2003, The Amityville Horror from 2005, and The House of Wax from 2005 had proven audiences were ready to see these horror classics reimagined for a new generation. When I hear the phrase 2000s horror remake, I usually think of two different types of movies. The first simply updates the original with a bigger budget and more graphic violence. The second asks a much more interesting question. How do you retell the same exact story for a completely different generation? And I think the 2006 remake of The Hills Have Eyes answers that second one quite nicely. What is especially interesting is that this remake was not made against the wishes of the original filmmaker Wes Craven. Wes Craven personally chose Alexandre Aja after watching High Tension because he felt that he completely understood what made horror unsettling. And that exact endorsement is what makes this remake feel so respectful to the original while still having its own identity. As for the story, it is largely the same. It is another family making a wrong turn into the desert on a road trip, and they encounter another family that lives in the hills. But almost immediately, you can tell this isn't just trying to recreate the original film shot for shot. Everything feels bigger. The cinematography here is stunning, the sound design is actually excellent, and the practical effects are some of the best of the 2000s. But perhaps most importantly is the violence. It is not implied at all. It's immediate, it's graphic, and it is unsettling to have to watch at times. And for some viewers, that's actually exactly why they prefer the original. For others, including myself, I think the brutality serves a purpose in this film. Alexandre Aja doesn't make violence exciting. He makes it very traumatic in this film. Every attack feels like an event that permanently changes the people who survive it. And just like Craven's original, the violence is not the point. It is a catalyst for the transformation that is going to happen across the film. But where the remake really separates itself is the changes that it makes under the surface. In the original film, Jupiter's family simply exist. They are an isolated clan that is living outside of civilization. But the remake asks a very important question. What if civilization is the one that creates these exact monsters? Rather than leaving the mutants' origins completely ambiguous, Aja ties the mutant story directly to government nuclear testing. The film suggests that these people were displaced, abandoned, and ultimately deformed by America's own weapon programs. And now suddenly, the horror is not just coming from the hills. And that one small change completely transforms this entire film's themes. The original film asks whether ordinary people can become the monsters. And the remake is now asking whether society actually creates these monsters through neglect, violence, or the pursuit of power. And now, the mutants aren't actually the villains anymore. They're just collateral damage by a bigger villain. Now, that doesn't excuse or condone anything that they're doing, it just makes them tragic in a way that the original film never attempted. Now, I think it is almost impossible to separate this film from the time in which it released. The original came out in 1977 when America was dealing with the aftermath of Vietnam and Watergate. and the remake arrives in 2006 in a completely different era while dealing with its own struggles. America was smack dab in the middle of a war on terror. Conversations about military power, government decisions, and the consequences of violence were absolutely everywhere in the 2000s. Whether Alexandre Aja intended for this film to have direct political statements or not, these anxieties are all over this film. This is most noticeable in the opening scenes, with images of deformed children and references to nuclear testing suggest that the horrors have long been around, way before the Carter family ever even arrives in the desert. If the emotional core of the original film was Doug questioning his own humanity, then the remake pushes that idea even farther. At the beginning of the film, Doug is almost dismissed by the entire family. He's quiet, he's awkward, nobody really takes him seriously, and his father-in-law, Big Bob, clearly doesn't think he is capable of protecting his own family. But as we see, by the end of the film, Doug pretty much turns into a one-man army. But unlike traditional action heroes, Doug's transformation really just does not feel triumphant at all. Because for each person that Doug kills, it almost feels like a piece of him disappears. Yes, he is still saving his daughter, but unfortunately it feels like he's succumbing to the exact savagery that these mutants have lived by their whole life. And so, just like the original Craven film, the remake leaves us wondering whether survival comes at the cost of our own humanity. And so, I do think this is one of the better horror remakes that we have ever gotten. It fundamentally understands exactly what the original film was going for, adds onto it, changes the themes around a little bit, and goes off in its own unique direction and stands on its own 2 feet. Because it fundamentally understands exactly what made the original film work so well in the first place. It respects Craven's original idea that civilization is fragile while still updating it for a new modern era, where the monsters are not simply just hiding in the hills anymore, they are the consequences of our own actions. After the success of the 2006 remake, a sequel was inevitably going to happen. Releasing just 1 year later in 2007, The Hills Have Eyes 2 ends up taking the franchise in a very different direction though. Instead of simply following another family that gets lost in the desert from a wrong turn, the film chooses to follow a group of National Guard trainees that are sent into the desert to deliver supplies to a military research station. But when they arrive, they discover that the research station has been abandoned, all the scientists have disappeared, and before long, they are forced to fight for survival against the remaining mutants. On paper, I think this is actually a really smart idea. The biggest addition to the 2006 remake was the connection made between the mutants and the government nuclear testing program, so that naturally raises a question of, would the government ever return to this testing site? And that's exactly where this sequel begins. Rather than simply just having another family stranded in the desert story, this film attempts to expand the world that Alexandre Aja established in the remake. But unfortunately, it never really capitalizes on that exact premise. One of the biggest noticeable differences between this film and all the other previous films is the choice of characters that we are following. The Carter family from both the original film and the remake are just ordinary people after all. They are not prepared, they are not trained, and having to watch them adapt to these extreme circumstances is what makes both of those films so compelling. Here though, our protagonists are a group of military soldiers. They are trained, they are prepared to fight, they are well armed, and that completely changes the entire dynamic of the film. Instead of feeling like a desperate struggle for survival, the film kind of just turns into a generic military film with horror elements. Now that's not to say that that is a bad thing in any way whatsoever, it is just a fundamentally different experience. For me, this is where the sequel struggles the most. Both the original and the 2006 remake worked so well because they gave us characters that we ended up caring for because we spent so much time with them before anything actually happened. We understood their family dynamics and we cared about their relationships. Doug's transformation, for example, meant something because we went from a character that was completely underestimated and he transformed into a character that was willing to do anything it took to save his family. And the sequel to it just never really gives us characters with the same depth. Most of the National Guard trainees are just single personality trait characters that are just thrown into a slaughter. And as a result, their deaths just turn into a single action set piece rather than an emotional turning point. Where the remake is more about losing your family and doing whatever it takes for survival, the sequel is mainly just about surviving the mission. One thing I will say that I do really appreciate about this film is that it tries to expand the mutants' world. We see more of their underground tunnels, and we also get to see more of how they actually survive. The military outpost suggests that the government is finally dealing with the consequences of their actions, and those ideas on paper actually have a lot of potential. In another version of this movie, I think it would have been really interesting if they had tackled themes of accountability, government secrecy, and the cost of erasing past mistakes. Instead, any notion of ideas like that getting explored are completely pushed into the background, and instead the film tends to focus more on the gore and the action. All in all, I don't hate The Hills Have Eyes 2. I actually think it is a lot more ambitious than the original Hills Have Eyes 2 from 1985 because it at least tries to move the story forward in some way rather than relying on the original to do all of the heavy lifting. But unfortunately, ambition and execution are two completely different things, and whereas the original film focuses on themes of civilization, its fragility, and savagery, the remake focusing on government secrecy and how people create their own monsters, the sequel just never really creates any ideas or expands upon those ideas in any real noticeable way. Instead, it becomes a fairly standard military action horror movie in the end. It is entertaining enough for fans of creature features and horror movies, but unfortunately, it will never meet the emotional or thematic depth of the films that came before it. And ultimately, I think that's what holds this film back from being truly good. It expands the world, yes, but it never really deepens it. In the end, I think The Hills Have Eyes is such a fascinating snapshot of how horror has evolved over 30 years. The 1977 original still remains as a thought-provoking exploration of the fragility of civilization, morality, and what happens when society's rules just completely disappear. Its 1985 sequel loses much of the thematic depth that made the original film so good while chasing trends of the 80s slashers, ultimately making it the weakest film in the franchise. The 2006 remake proves that not every remake has to live in the shadow of its predecessor. It manages to honor Wes Craven's original film while also modernizing it for a new generation with strong characters and a fresh perspective on its themes. And while the 2007 sequel never quite reaches the heights of the remake, I think it deserves some credit for attempting to expand the world in some way rather than simply just repeating the same story of a family getting lost in the desert and trying to survive. Looking back at all four films across 30 years, I think it is important to note one thing. The mutants may be the face of the franchise, but they've never been the heart of it. At its best, The Hills Have Eyes has always been about ordinary people being pushed to extraordinary limits and asking the question what any of us might become if survival was all that mattered. And that is my look at the Hills Have Eyes franchise, spanning 30 years. Whether you prefer the gritty atmosphere of the 1977 original, or you prefer the brutal intensity of the 2006 remake, or maybe you just really have fun with the 2007 sequel, I think there is something to appreciate across all of these films. Even the 1985 film can be fun at times. Have you seen any or all of these films? I would love to hear what you think about them in the comments below. Do you agree with my takes? Do you not agree with my takes? I would love to hear from you. If you enjoyed this video and this retrospective, please stick around, hit that like, hit that subscribe button, so make sure that you're getting notifications for when any of my videos are being posted, and I hope to see you guys on the next video, and remember, stay spooky.